"Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step off this plane." The words came from the cockpit door, where Captain Richard Hayes, the pilot, stood tall with his crisp uniform pressed to perfection. His voice carried the kind of authority passengers rarely challenged. Every eye in the cabin shifted to the woman in seat 14C. She was calm, neatly dressed in a navy blue business suit, a leather briefcase tucked beneath her seat. Her only crime, as far as anyone could tell, had been quietly asking the flight attendant why her overhead bag was removed without her permission. Now, the pilot was staring down at her with cold finality. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," she said softly, though her voice carried a quiet steel. But Hayes didn't flinch. "You've been disruptive. You either leave voluntarily, or security will escort you out." Gasps rippled across the rows. Some passengers pulled out phones. Others whispered in disbelief. A black woman, humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers, ordered off the very flight she had paid for. What no one knew, not the passengers, not the flight attendants, and certainly not the arrogant pilot, was that this woman was no ordinary traveler, and the decision he had just made would come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. Her name was Dr. Maya Thompson. To the world outside this cabin, she was a seasoned professional, measured, meticulous, and highly respected. But in this moment, she was just a passenger, fighting the familiar knot in her chest that came with situations like this. Maya had learned long ago how prejudice could disguise itself as procedure or policy. She had experienced it in boardrooms, in conferences, and in airports. But what unsettled her wasn't just the humiliation. It was the casual ease with which people like Captain Hayes carried out decisions that could alter someone's entire day, career, or dignity, without a flicker of doubt. Still, Maya wasn't one to fight battles in public aisles. She gathered her belongings with grace, rose from her seat, and walked the long, narrow stretch toward the exit under the weight of hundreds of curious eyes. She looked ordinary to them. Another passenger inconvenienced, another incident smoothed over by authority. But hidden beneath her calm composure was a reality the captain was blissfully unaware of. Dr. Maya Thompson was an executive board member of the very airline he worked for, and the quiet dignity with which she left that plane was not a weakness. It was the silence before a storm. For Dr. Maya Thompson, flying was nothing new. She had spent more than half her professional career crisscrossing continents. Conferences, meetings, summits, late-night red-eye flights that blurred into one another. But this flight was different. It wasn't just another trip on her calendar. It was supposed to be a routine inspection, disguised as travel. Maya wasn't just a passenger. She sat on the executive board of Atlantic Skies Airlines, a company she had helped guide through turbulence both financial and cultural. A quiet leader, she had earned her position not by shouting the loudest but by thinking the sharpest. Her colleagues often described her as the calm in the storm, the kind of leader who asked the question no one else thought of. But those who knew her privately understood the cost of that calm. The years of being dismissed, underestimated, and occasionally outright disrespected, all while having to smile and maintain poise. It wasn't her style to announce her position to the world. To her, true leadership meant moving unseen, listening before acting, and catching blind spots others ignored, which was why she often booked flights unannounced, sitting among ordinary passengers, observing the culture of her airline from the ground up. She never expected, though, that the very culture she was monitoring would turn against her this openly. On the other side of the story stood Captain Richard Hayes. Richard had been flying for over 20 years. To most, he was the textbook image of a pilot. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried authority and a reputation for never losing control in the cockpit. Among junior crew members, his word was law. But beneath the polished uniform and confident smile was something else. A man who had grown used to being obeyed, unquestioned. For Hayes, command wasn't just part of the job. It was his identity. Every flight was his kingdom, every decision a final decree. Those who liked him called him decisive. Those who didn't called him arrogant. But whatever the word, his authority rarely faced challenge. And when it did, he responded swiftly, often too swiftly. Flight attendants whispered stories of him overreacting to passengers who asked too many questions, of his impatience with those who didn't fit the mold of how he believed air travel should be. Nothing ever escalated enough to reach corporate ears, but his record wasn't spotless. And today, as fate would have it, his rigid sense of control had collided with Maya's quiet resistance. For Maya, this wasn't her first encounter with the kind of authority Hayes embodied. She remembered boardrooms where male executives talked over her, subtly erasing her ideas only to present them later as their own. She remembered networking dinners where strangers assumed she was someone's assistant instead of a decision-maker. She remembered the sting of random checks at airports that always seemed to target her when she traveled alone. All of it built a familiar script, and today, in that narrow aisle of Atlantic Sky's Flight 482, the script was playing out once again. Yet, what Hayes couldn't have imagined was that the very passenger he had deemed disruptive had the power to review his career, influence his future promotions, and determine whether men like him continued to define the culture of the airline. But Maya wasn't eager for revenge. Her career had taught her that real change wasn't about humiliating one man. It was about exposing the system that gave him permission to act the way he did. Still, as she walked off that plane, briefcase in hand, a voice deep inside her whispered, "This one won't slide." The day had started with small inconveniences, the kind Maya had learned to let pass. It began at the check-in counter, when the agent gave her that tight smile, polite, but not welcoming, before asking twice whether she was sure she was in the right line for business priority boarding. She'd brushed it off, answering with the same calm tone she always used, "Yes, I am." Then, at security, she'd been pulled aside for a random screening. She'd smiled at the officer, though inside she noted how often random seemed to find her. Her briefcase had been swabbed, her laptop double-checked, and though it added 10 minutes to her journey, she didn't let the irritation show. But once she boarded the plane, the pattern became harder to ignore. When Maya reached her row, seat 14C, she found her overhead bin already packed. She politely flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with perfectly pinned hair and a slightly harried look. "Excuse me," Maya said, lifting her carry-on. "This was supposed to be reserved for my row. Could we move some items?" The attendant glanced at her, then shook her head briskly. "You'll need to put it farther back." "That's fine," Maya replied, forcing patience. "But could I ask that it stays near me? I'll need quick access to my laptop during the flight." The attendant hesitated, then gave a clipped nod. Moments later, Maya noticed her bag being shifted several rows back without explanation. It was the kind of minor dismissal that, in isolation, could be excused. But stacked onto a lifetime of experiences, it pressed like a weight against her chest. Still, she sat down quietly, smoothing the folds of her gray suit. She reminded herself of the purpose of this trip: quiet observation, a chance to experience the airline from the customer's seat. But fate had other plans. As boarding neared its close, she noticed Captain Hayes stride down the aisle, inspecting the cabin. It wasn't standard for him to do so, but he had a reputation for showing presence when he felt order needed reinforcing. His gaze scanned over passengers, a nod here, a polite smile there. But when his eyes landed on Maya, they lingered. Something flickered across his face, a mixture of irritation and scrutiny, as though her very presence unsettled the picture he wanted of his cabin. He stopped at her row. "Everything all right here?" His voice carried, drawing curious glances. Maya kept her tone calm. "Yes, Captain. Just asked about the overhead space, but it's been handled." Hayes's brow tightened. "Handled? I heard there was a bit of disagreement." "A simple question," Maya clarified. "Nothing more." He tilted his head, his stance broadening slightly. "I need to make sure all passengers comply with crew instructions. No disruptions." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Passengers across the aisle shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen but unable to look away. Maya inhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Of course, I've complied fully." But Hayes wasn't satisfied. He lingered, studying her in a way that made clear this was less about procedure and more about control. Then, without warning, he turned to the attendant. "Keep an eye here," he said, his tone clipped. "Last thing we need is trouble at 30,000 feet." Maya felt her cheeks warm, though her expression didn't break. Trouble? The word dug at her. Not shouted, not explicit, but heavy with insinuation. The flight attendant returned twice during the next 20 minutes before takeoff, under the guise of checking on her. Each time, her tone carried that same subtle edge, as if expecting Maya to snap or misbehave. By the third visit, Maya leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. She thought of her mother, who used to tell her, "Some battles you fight, others you outlast. Wisdom is knowing which is which." But the pressure didn't ease. When a white male passenger across the aisle loudly complained about a seat mix-up, the crew soothed him with apologetic smiles, quickly finding a solution. No stern warnings, no trouble insinuations. Maya noted the difference silently, tucking it away. Finally, the moment arrived. As passengers settled, Hayes appeared once more, this time stepping fully into the cabin. His expression was hard, decisive. "Ma'am," he said firmly, voice carrying over the rose, "you'll need to step off this plane." The words froze the air. Conversations halted, heads turned. Maya blinked slowly, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. "Excuse me, you've been disruptive," Hayes announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This aircraft cannot depart until you comply. Please gather your belongings." The flight attendant stood stiffly beside him, arms folded, as if waiting for backup. Maya's chest tightened. She felt every eye on her. Strangers judging, some sympathetic, others suspicious. She thought of the dozens of flights she'd taken unnoticed, of how quickly dignity could be stripped away with a single accusation. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. "I followed every instruction given to me. On what grounds am I being removed?" Hayes didn't flinch. "On mine. As captain, my authority is final. You can leave voluntarily, or security will escort you." The silence was suffocating. Someone in the back whispered. Another pulled out a phone. A child asked their parents what was happening. Maya gathered her briefcase, her movements deliberate. She rose, spine straight, eyes fixed ahead. Each step down the aisle felt like walking through a tunnel of stairs, some sympathetic, others quietly agreeing with the captain's unspoken narrative. Inside, she felt the sting of humiliation, but layered with something else. A cold, sharpened resolve. Because while Hayes believed he had won control of his cabin, he had no idea he had just walked himself into the storm of his career. The automatic doors of the jet bridge slid shut behind her with a hiss, leaving Maya in the hushed hallway that led back to the terminal. Two uniformed security officers walked beside her. Not forceful, not aggressive, but present all the same, as if her calm walk down the ramp required supervision. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. She simply walked, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, every step echoing in her chest like a drumbeat. Passengers peered curiously from the gate area as she emerged, some whispering, others staring at her with that look. The look that said she must have done something. But Maya didn't meet their eyes. She kept her gaze forward, shoulders squared. To them, she was just a woman being escorted off a plane. But to herself, she was something far more dangerous. A leader with receipts, with a title, and with power in places the captain couldn't yet imagine. Back on the aircraft, Hayes returned to the cockpit, brushing his hands against his uniform as though shaking off the encounter. "That should settle things," he muttered. The co-pilot, a younger man named Daniel Rivera, glanced at him uncertainly. "Captain, she didn't seem disruptive to me." Hayes's jaw tightened. "She questioned the crew, didn't she? Challenged procedure? That's a disruption. If I don't enforce order now, where does it stop?" Rivera didn't answer. He'd flown with Hayes before. He knew better than to push too far. But something in his gut twisted uneasily. Meanwhile, Maya stood quietly at the gate desk, waiting as the airline staff scrambled to figure out what box to put her in. A supervisor approached, flustered. "Ma'am, we apologize for the inconvenience. Would you like us to rebook you on another flight?" Maya turned slowly, her eyes steady. "No, that won't be necessary." The supervisor hesitated, sensing something different in her tone. Something measured. Something that didn't fit the picture of a disgruntled passenger. Before he could respond, Maya pulled out her phone. With a few swift motions, she drafted a message. Not a complaint, not an angry outburst, just a short, precise note sent to the airline's executive WhatsApp channel. Flight 482, passenger removed by Captain Hayes. I'll need a full incident report on my desk by tomorrow morning. She pressed send, then slid her phone back into her briefcase. Her face betrayed nothing. Up in the cockpit, Hayes was preparing for pushback when the interphone buzzed. The gate supervisor's voice came through, tight with nervousness. "Captain Hayes, we have a situation." Hayes frowned. "We already handled the situation, sir," the voice stammered. "The passenger you just removed, her name is Dr. Maya Thompson." There was a pause. Hayes's brow furrowed. And another pause, longer this time. Then, "She's on the board of directors." The words landed like a blow. Hayes blinked, his mouth parting slightly before he caught himself. "That can't be right," he muttered. But even as he said it, his gut twisted. "Yes, sir. Confirmed. She just contacted headquarters directly." Hayes's throat went dry. For the first time in years, Captain Richard Hayes felt the air shift around him. Not in the cockpit, not in the cabin, but in the invisible space of authority he had always assumed was his alone. He leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on the controls in front of him, but his thoughts spinning wildly. Board of directors? The realization clawed at him. The passenger he had so confidently dismissed, the one he'd paraded in front of the cabin as a disruptive problem, wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was someone who had the power to summon him into a boardroom, strip his stripes, and question every decision he had ever made. And she had left that plane not shouting, not begging, but silent. The kind of silence that meant she didn't need to prove anything. In the gate area, Maya sat quietly near a window, watching the aircraft she'd been forced off prepare for departure. Her phone buzzed with a reply from a fellow board member. "We'll handle this. Sit tight. Safe travels on the next rotation. We'll discuss at headquarters." She exhaled slowly, letting the message settle. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. Still, she couldn't ignore the flicker of satisfaction deep inside. Not because Hayes would face consequences, but because he had written his own downfall with absolute confidence, never once stopping to imagine that the woman he dismissed might hold more power than he did. And now, as the engines roared to life, the stage was set. The flight would depart, but Hayes's career would never fly quite as smoothly again. The flight that had left without her was barely halfway across the sky when Hayes's phone buzzed in the cockpit. The message came through the internal airline channel, flagged urgent. "Captain Hayes, upon arrival you are required to report directly to headquarters. Mandatory debrief. Incident regarding Flight 482 passenger removal under review." His stomach tightened. He had expected paperwork, perhaps a standard report, but not this. Not a direct summons before his wheels even touched the runway. Rivera, his co-pilot, noticed the flicker of unease in his captain's face. "Everything all right?" Hayes forced a nod, but his grip on the control yoke was tighter than usual. Just corporate nonsense. But he knew better. He knew he was about to walk into a storm. 2 days later, the storm arrived. The conference room at Atlantic Sky's headquarters was glass-walled, sterile, and humming with quiet power. Executives gathered around the long mahogany table, their expressions carefully neutral. And at the head of that table sat Dr. Maya Thompson. Hayes entered stiffly, his uniform crisp but his confidence rattled. He tried to steady his breathing as he approached the table, but the weight of the eyes on him pressed heavier than any G-force he'd ever endured in the cockpit. "Maya," he said, forcing a polite smile. "Dr. Thompson." Her gaze lifted slowly, deliberate, her expression unreadable. "Captain Hayes, please sit." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The room seemed to still be around it. He sat across from her, shoulders squared, eyes darting briefly to the other board members before returning to her. "Before we begin," Maya said, folding her hands neatly on the table, "I want you to understand something. When you asked me to leave Flight 482, I complied without resistance. I did so not because I agreed with your assessment, but because the safety of the passengers comes first, even when that safety is being undermined by poor judgment." Her words were calm, but each one landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward. Hayes swallowed hard. "Dr. Thompson, She lifted a hand, stopping him. "You accused me of being disruptive. Do you recall what my disruption consisted of?" Hayes hesitated. "You questioned the crew about your bag." "That's correct," Maya said evenly. "A bag that was removed from my assigned overhead without explanation. I asked a question. That was all. And for that, you escalated the matter until I was escorted from an aircraft I had every right to be on." Her gaze didn't waver. "Do you understand the gravity of that decision?" Hayes shifted in his seat, his composure thinning. "With respect, I was acting in the best interest of the flight. Any challenge to crew authority can—" "Authority," Maya interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time, "is not licensed to humiliate passengers, especially when that authority is wielded unevenly." The room fell silent. A few executives exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Hayes's chest tightened. For years, he had commanded cabins, crews, and cockpits with absolute certainty. But now, sitting across from Maya, he felt stripped of that certainty. "Dr. Thompson," he said carefully, "if I overstepped, I regret how it played out. But my first priority has always been control." Maya pressed. "Or safety, because they are not the same thing, Captain. And on that flight, your need for control outweighed your duty to safety. You chose to remove a paying passenger not because she posed a threat, but because she refused to shrink under your gaze." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Hayes's mouth opened, then closed. For once, the captain had no command to give, no order to bark, no decree to assert. Maya leaned forward, her tone lowering, more intimate now but no less firm. "Let me make this clear. I will not tolerate behavior in this airline that mirrors the very prejudices we claim to rise above. You didn't see me as a professional, a leader, or even a human deserving of courtesy. You saw me as a problem to be removed, and that, Captain Hayes, is unacceptable." Her eyes bore into his, steady, unflinching. "The question is not whether you understand me now. The question is whether you can unlearn the habits that brought us here." Hayes sat frozen, the realization crashing down fully. The uniform that had always protected him felt suddenly thin, almost meaningless. He wasn't in command here. He wasn't the authority. For the first time in decades, he was just a man, and across from him sat the woman he had underestimated, who now held the course of his career in her hands. The silence stretched long and heavy, and then Maya leaned back, her voice once again calm. "This isn't over. The board will decide the appropriate action. But know this, Captain, your reputation as a leader will no longer be measured by the control you exert, but by the dignity you preserve." The silence in the cabin after Hayes left was almost suffocating. For a few long beats, no one moved. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, whispers darting like shadows. The passengers, who had moments ago been buzzing with shock, now sat in brittle quiet, half waiting for another explosion, half fearful of what it all meant. Maya didn't stand, didn't gesture, didn't try to soothe the room. She just breathed, steady and unbroken, her eyes fixed forward. Inside, her pulse was still racing, but she forced herself into calm, the kind of calm only years of composure at the top of an unforgiving industry could forge. When Hayes returned to the cabin, his face was pale, his expression brittle. The swagger, the condescension, it was gone. In its place, a brittle quiet, a man who had suddenly realized the depth of his mistake. He avoided her eyes at first, directing himself instead to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I'd like to apologize for the disruption earlier. We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." His voice cracked at patience. It was the kind of crack that came from humiliation swallowing a man whole. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmurs growing louder now. They knew, most of them at least, that something had shifted, that the man who had tried to throw Maya off her own airline's flight was no longer in control. When he finally looked at her, there was no hiding, just a silent acknowledgement. No words, just a bow of the head, a flicker of something like regret, or perhaps just survival. The plane lifted into the night sky soon after. The cabin dimmed, passengers dozing, attendants rolling carts. But Maya sat awake, staring at the city lights falling away below. She thought about the irony of it all. A man so quick to dismiss her, to strip her dignity in public, never knowing she was the very person who signed his checks, who oversaw his promotions, who carried the power to end his career with a single decision. And the weight of that knowledge didn't bring satisfaction. It brought exhaustion. She had endured public humiliation. She had been tested in the cruelest way, not as an executive, not as a leader, but as a black woman in a space where her authority and identity had been erased until it became inconvenient for someone else. When the plane landed, Maya didn't linger. She gathered her bag, gave a polite nod to the crew, and walked off. No grand speech, no vindictive declaration, just quiet dignity. But the aftermath unfolded swiftly. Within 48 hours, the story leaked. A passenger had recognized her, snapped discreet photos, and shared them online with a caption that burned across social media. Some defended Hayes, claiming he followed protocol. Others tore into the incident as a glaring example of racial bias, sexism, and unchecked ego. Maya's name trended worldwide, not as a faceless executive, but as a woman humiliated yet unbroken. The board convened an emergency session. Hayes was grounded pending investigation. Whispers of termination spread. The pilot who once carried himself as untouchable now faced an avalanche of scrutiny. And Maya? She stood before the board, calm and resolute. She didn't demand Hayes be fired. She didn't rant or rage. She simply laid out the facts, the breach of conduct, the unnecessary escalation, the humiliation endured. And then she did something that caught even her colleagues off guard. She called for systemic change, not for herself, but for every passenger who might sit in her seat without her title, without her shield of power. Every black traveler, every woman, every quiet figure who carried dignity yet risked being stripped of it by bias and arrogance. This isn't about me. It's about who we are as an airline. If this can happen to your CEO, imagine what happens every day to those without a voice, without power. Fix the system, not just the man, she said. Her words left the room silent. Hayes was eventually dismissed, not out of vengeance, but because his judgment had proven dangerous. The airline instituted new training, new accountability checks. Policies shifted. Conversations that had been whispered now roared. And Maya? She returned to work. No victory parade, no indulgent triumph. Just the quiet knowledge that she had endured, that she had turned her humiliation into momentum for change. But in the privacy of her home, late at night, she let herself feel the ache. The memory of those eyes watching her as Hayes tried to strip her dignity. The humiliation didn't vanish with his downfall. It lingered like a bruise. And yet, beneath the pain, there was power. Because when she walked back into her office, every executive, every employee, every crew member now knew. The woman who had once been underestimated was the very backbone of the airline. And no one would ever forget it again. The question lingers, what would you have done if you were Maya? Would you have revealed your position the moment Hayes challenged you? Or would you, like her, let the truth unravel on its own? Because sometimes, the most powerful confrontation isn't the one you start. It's the one you finish without lifting your voice. What do you think? Did Hayes deserve harsher consequences, or was the humiliation of being exposed enough? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more real, gripping stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.